Is Brandon Sanderson a good author? A lot of you might not know who I am, but my name is Mohammed, and about a week ago I started posting TikToks for fun, and I started talking about the fantasy authors and the fantasy books that I have read my entire life. And I also mentioned how Brandon Sanderson is my favorite author. The first video I posted was about every book I have ever given a 10 out of 10 to. And of those 8 or so books, 4 of them were by Brandon Sanderson. And a side note before I get into the bulk of what I want to talk about today, I've only been doing this social media stuff for about 8 to 10 days now, and it's been an absolutely wild ride. To those of you that haven't come over from TikTok, I went viral on TikTok with the first video I ever posted, getting about 2.6 million views, which is absolutely insane. I never expected it, and while I thought I might get a few hundred views, I never thought it would go as crazy as it did. And now about 10 days later, or whatever it's been, I have like 26,000 followers, and it seems like a lot of you were interested in watching YouTube videos from me, so here we are. Going back to Brandon Sanderson, a lot of my videos feature him and his books heavily, and that's because he is my favorite author, which is something I mentioned in the very first video I posted and have said repeatedly since. I have every single leatherbound he's ever published. I participated in that legendary Kickstarter, and I even went to Dragonsteel a couple of years ago. And apparently a lot of people find that offensive because, quote unquote, Brandon Sanderson is not a good author. I made a much shorter video about this on TikTok a few days ago to address what I thought were the criticisms coming his way, but obviously the conversation has evolved since then, including from some trolls who I'm just not going to address, who just seem to take pleasure in putting down what other people like because it makes them feel smarter. What I want to focus on instead is some of the more legitimate criticism that I saw in the comments on that video I posted about Brandon Sanderson and his works. In that original video, I made the assertion that the only people who criticize Brandon Sanderson are people who don't like his prose. And some people responded saying that that's not necessarily true, that very often not just his prose, but also his characters and dialogue are lacking. And while that criticism puzzled me at first, the more I thought about it and the more I talked to people about it, the more I came to understand where these criticisms were coming from. So I wanted to make this video to address some of those comments specifically and to talk about why I still would assert that Brandon Sanderson is a good author and why you should read him. I'll preface this all by saying that Brandon Sanderson obviously doesn't need me to defend him, or anyone else for that matter. He's doing pretty well for himself. He's probably the best-selling fantasy author alive other than George R.R. Martin and J.K. Rowling. But I do find this interesting to talk about because even other than Brandon Sanderson, I obviously read a lot of fantasy and I'm really curious about what people like and do not like in the genre. So let's start off with Brandon Sanderson's prose. Now, I said this in the original TikTok I posted about this, but it's true that Brandon Sanderson himself has admitted that prose is probably one of his weaknesses as an author. Now, a lot of people were asking in the TikTok what exactly I mean by prose, and for those of you unfamiliar with the term, it just means your writing style, how you craft sentences. If you want competing examples of simple prose like Brandon Sanderson's or more complex and beautiful prose, just read a page written by Brandon Sanderson and then read a page written by someone like Scott Lynch or George R.R. Martin, and you'll probably figure out what I mean. A lot of classics you'll also read about will have far from simple prose, if you want another point of comparison. It's just the way you write, how you convey the information you're trying to convey. And for some fantasy readers who maybe like things like Scott Lynch and Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson, prose is important. Every sentence they read, they want it to be beautifully crafted. They want to enjoy not just the content of what they're reading, but the way it's written and conveyed as well. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If that's a priority for you, good. Brandon Sanderson might not be for you. And I say might not because, as I'm going to dive into, I don't think the prose criticism holds true for Brandon Sanderson's more recent works, especially Yumi and the Nightmare Painter and Tress of the Emerald Sea. But to go back to the original criticism, that Brandon Sanderson as an author has weak prose, I'll lead off by saying that this is legitimate criticism. The issue I have is the emphasis that people place on it. Very often you'll hear people saying that prose is literally how you write. So for an author like Brandon Sanderson to have weak prose is just unacceptable. And to those people I say two things. First of all, that's a baseless assertion that prose is the most important thing you can do as an author. Plot, dialogue, and character are all equally important aspects of a story, like I said in my original TikTok. And you can say what you want about Brandon Sanderson's character and dialogue, and I'll get to those in a minute, but you cannot deny that the man knows how to craft the plot. It's what he's most well known for, and you cannot deny that he sets up really satisfying and thematically appropriate conclusions to his stories, whether that be in the form of a standalone like Elantris, it's currently a standalone, it might get sequels in the future, or in the form of a trilogy like Mistborn. To dismiss all the good qualities Brandon Sanderson has as someone who knows how to craft the plot and is maybe the best in the world at it, just because his prose might not be to your taste, is just absolutely ridiculous and makes you a frustrating person to have this conversation with. Now, setting aside the fact that this is a valid criticism of Brandon's earlier works, especially Elantris and other books like Warbreaker, people also ignore the fact that his prose has drastically improved since his early days as an author. It's something he's acknowledged he consciously works on, and it shows. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter and Tress of the Emerald Sea had some really beautifully written passages. Just because those passages aren't representative of how he writes everything doesn't mean that he's not good at prose or that he can't write prose. He's also repeatedly said that he makes his prose simple on purpose so that his books are more accessible to more readers, because his priority is telling satisfying stories. I'm not sure if he said the word satisfying, but he has talked about how he loves to tell stories, and that's his priority. So in sum, what I'll say about prose is that it's not the single most important aspect of writing. It might be for you, and that's fine, but it doesn't have to be for everyone. And plot, character, and dialogue are all equally important, at least to some readers, if not more important to other readers like myself. Now, on my my original TikTok, there were a lot of other comments talking about how Brandon's character and dialogue are also frequently lacking. I'll note as a side note, not a single person tried to challenge me on the plot point and how Brandon Sanderson is amazing at crafting a plot. And to those people, I have a couple of things to say. First, I get the criticism about his character work and how his characters sometimes don't have an arc, like in Elantris. In my original TikTok, I used Warbreaker as an example, and in hindsight, that was probably a bad example. The characters in that story do have pretty comprehensive arcs that are pretty well explored and established. But Elantris is a good example of one of his earlier works that don't really feature character arcs. The main characters featured in the story have the personalities they have, and they don't really change over the course of the story. And if you're someone who wants to watch a character arc, you want to watch a character come into their own through the course of the story, then Elantris probably isn't for you. But again, to try and dismiss Brandon Sanderson as an author just because some of his books don't feature character arcs is just silly. I don't know anyone who makes the same criticism of someone like Joe Abercrombie, who also does the same thing, where he has characters who have established personalities and mannerisms, and they stay the same pretty much for the entire book. Character arcs aren't a focus for Joe Abercrombie, and sometimes they're not a focus for Brandon Sanderson. That's not really a valid criticism to then dismiss him as an author by saying, oh, Elantris had no character development. It might be why the book isn't for you, but it doesn't dismiss everything else he's accomplished and does as an author.
Just gonna jump in here quick to say something that I forgot to mention, and that's that even though Brandon Sanderson's early books like Elantris might be subject to criticism about his character work, I don't think his more recent books, especially the Stormlight Archive, are subject to the same criticism. If you are someone that enjoys good character work in their fantasy books, you should read Brandon Sanderson. I didn't mean to suggest that his character work isn't amazing. It is. Characters like Dalinar, Kaladin, and Shallan are some of the best characters I've ever read in fiction.
The dialogue criticism, where some people were saying that the dialogue in his book seems AI generated or seems robotic, is a criticism that I personally hadn't come across before and left me a little puzzled because I've never felt that way about his books. And I went back and I read some of his more recent books and I still didn't understand the criticism, so this is one I don't really have too much to say about because I just don't understand the criticism or what books or passages or dialogue people are talking about. If someone in the comments who shares this criticism of Brandon Sanderson can give me some specific examples of dialogue that they felt was subpar by Brandon Sanderson, I'd love to see it and I'd love to talk to you about it because frankly I just don't understand the criticism. The last thing I want to talk about is this criticism that Brandon Sanderson writes Marvel-like books that are more appropriately characterized as YA rather than adult fantasy. First of all, to the extent that the criticism is based on the fact that he writes books aimed at a larger audience and therefore is Marvel-esque, I'll say that if that's all that you find in common between the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Brandon Sanderson's books, that's not really a valid comparison. Just because you aim for as large an audience as possible doesn't say anything about the content of your work. I also don't think it's fair to say that Brandon only writes happy-go-lucky comedic kinds of books because that's just not true. And this also goes a little bit to the YA point where people say that he doesn't deal with any dark or adult themes. I frankly don't understand what people are saying about this. The most I can gather is that these people are disappointed by the lack of sexual graphicness in his books, which fine, if you want to read that, go for it. Go read A Song of Ice and Fire if that's really that big a priority to you. But to then extrapolate from that he doesn't deal with adult themes is just a ridiculous statement. A lot of his books, like the Stormlight Archive, deal with very serious issues like depression, dissociative identity disorder, alcoholism. There's some pretty graphic violence towards the end of the Mistborn trilogy, which I won't talk about because it's spoilers. And the Stormlight Archive also obviously features a lot of violence. So again, when people say that he doesn't deal with adult themes and it's not really adult fantasy, I'm just left puzzled because they seem to be focusing only on one thing, and that's sexual explicitness. And if that's the only distinguishing factor between YA and adult fantasy, then fine, sure, maybe Brandon Sanderson is YA. But I personally think that the fact that he deals with things like depression, dissociative identity disorder, alcoholism, and such graphic violence firmly put him into the adult fantasy category in a way that it leaves me puzzled when people say that he's not adult fantasy. Just because your prose might not be difficult to read doesn't mean you're not adult fantasy. For example, I don't think anyone is out there trying to argue that Joe Abercrombie writes YA and not adult fantasy, even though his prose is also similarly accessible to Brandon Sanderson. At least I think it is. And that's a compliment, by the way. I have nothing against Joe Abercrombie. I love his books. I'll wrap this up by saying that if you don't like Brandon Sanderson, you've tried one or two of his books and it just wasn't for you, that's okay. Not everyone has to like everything. But to try and assert that because he doesn't align with what you're looking for in a book means that anyone who reads him is stupid or childish or hasn't read enough good books is just simply childish. I've read Malazan Book of the Fallen, I've read The Wheel of Time, I read Joe Abercrombie, I read Brent Weeks, I read Evan Winter, I've read almost everything on these two shelves, and Brandon Sanderson, frankly, is still my favorite author. Don't be so dismissive of other people's opinions and what other people enjoy just because you personally didn't enjoy it. And I'll say to my fellow Brandon Sanderson fans that when these people come up in the comment section or wherever and they're critical of Brandon Sanderson, let's not shoot them down immediately. If they're one of those people who's trying to be aggressive and saying like, oh, if you like Brandon Sanderson, you must have brain rot, which it was a real comment I think I got on one of my TikToks, then fine, you can treat them in kind. But there are valid criticisms to be had of him, and I'm open to those and always have been. But let's just be honest in our conversations. Brandon Sanderson is one of the best-selling authors of our time. It can't be the case that you're the only one smart enough to realize his books aren't good. And that's where I'll end this. Let's be honest about the conversations we have. Let's be respectful of each other. Now, as always, subscribe and go to TikTok and drop a follow, or else.